forcing fierce fighting around several Ukrainian cities. The Antonov 2 airfield north of Kyiv was taken by Russian airborne forces as part of the initial assault yesterday morning, but has reportedly been retaken by Ukrainian forces overnight. As the world has now seen, the intelligence available to the British and American governments over recent weeks has proven to be entirely accurate, and this allows us to assess that the Russians have failed to achieve any of their planned objectives for the first day of combat operations. The Ukrainian armed forces claim to have shot down 6 fixed-wing aircraft and 7 helicopters. They report that 137 Ukrainian service personnel have been killed in action, as well as 57 civilians. Hundreds more have been injured. The Ukrainian government also reports that 450 Russian service personnel have been killed in action. Mr. Speaker, as a former soldier with the vivid experience of death on the battlefield seared forever in my mind, I take no satisfaction in reporting those numbers to the House, nor do I propose that we keep a score every day. These are the lives of innocent civilians, and they are lives of the bravest and the best of Russians and Ukrainians. As we gorge on the live footage of a peer-on-peer war being broadcast from a European capital, just 2.5 hours flying time from London, we should remember that behind these pictures are incredible fear and misery. That is why, Mr. Speaker, I'll also pay tribute this morning to the protesters in Moscow, St. Petersburg and other Russian cities who protested last night against this pointless loss of Russian life. President Putin and the kleptocrats that surround him have miscalculated badly. Young Russian men and women are needlessly losing their lives. The responsibility sits entirely with the Kremlin. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, British Royal Air Force Tornado jets took part in NATO air policing from their base in RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, from where they patrolled over the Black Sea and southeastern Europe. HMS Trent is part of already a NATO standing maritime group. There are further Royal Navy ships being deployed to other NATO standing groups, both in the Baltic and in the Eastern Mediterranean. In addition to the Royal Tank Regiment battle group that has been in place in Estonia for the last 6 months, the Royal Welsh battle group will be arriving in Estonia earlier than planned to double up our force levels, and those doubled up force levels remain indefinitely. They will be augmented by the headquarters of 12 Mechanised Brigade, meaning that the United Kingdom will have an armoured brigade in Estonia, reassuring one of our closest NATO allies. Mr. Speaker, as you've heard from the Secretary of State, the Prime Minister and others over recent days, we will explore all that we can do to support the Ukrainians themselves over the next few days. But we must all in this House be clear that British and NATO troops should not, must not play an active role in Ukraine. We must all be clear what the risks of miscalculation could be and how existential that could very quickly become if people miscalculate and things escalate unnecessarily. The detail of the support the UK will provide to the Ukrainians at this very sensitive point in operations, Mr. Speaker, is not something I think the government feels it can share the detail of with the House. We apologise for that. We'll do our best to give the House as much as we can, but you'll appreciate that the detail is operationally sensitive, and I hope, Mr. Speaker, that that is acceptable to you. Finally, Mr. Speaker, you and front bench spokespeople from around the House have had briefings from Defence Intelligence. We'll make sure that that continues to happen so that on Privy Council terms briefings can be received by those who need to have them. Colleagues were also given a briefing last night by Defence Intelligence, which I know colleagues around the House have found useful. We intend to keep up those briefings for as long as we feel that there are kinetic combat operations that warrant a daily update. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, there's been a number of cross-party briefings from the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary, the next of which is this afternoon, where I will be joining the Foreign Secretary and a representative of the intelligence community to brief colleagues further.
Just to say, I've allowed this to run over. It's such an important matter, and quite rightly, I wanted to hear the Minister in full, and of course the same will be extended to the opposition and the SNP spokesperson. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Minister for the Armed Forces for his detailed update. And I'd also like to congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, for his leadership in this appalling crisis. Yesterday, President Putin, the Russian dictator, ordered a full-scale invasion of an independent, democratic state in the heart of Europe. The people of Ukraine at this very time are fighting for their homeland against a monstrous aggressor. We are seeing history repeat itself as a powerful country headed by a madman is extending its territorial boundaries, first by annexing regions of sovereign countries and then invading those countries. This, of course, is what happened in the 1930s and led to World War. I have the following 4 questions for the Minister, which are in support of our Ukrainian friends and in support of our Western democratic values. First, the Ukraine ambassador to the United Kingdom has asked for us and our allies to institute a no-fly zone over Ukraine. As the ambassador said, people are dying as we speak. This action will be a significant and a real help for the people of the Ukraine. Yesterday, when I asked the Prime Minister about this request, he indicated it was not ruled out. Could the Minister update the House on this request for help? Secondly, as far as the Minister can say, what additional military hardware are we providing as a practical support to the people of the Ukraine? Thirdly, what steps are being taken by NATO to reinforce its eastern flank? And fourthly, given that we are now in a situation worse than the Cold War, will we be increasing our spending on defence to reflect that reality? Mr. Speaker, may the prayers of this House and the thoughts of this House be with the people of Ukraine.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I firstly join the honourable gentleman in sending his prayers to the people of Ukraine. I know as I was watching last night some of the footage that was emerging, particularly from Kharkiv, of the artillery barrage, it just looked like hell on earth, and it was pretty hard not to say a prayer before you went to sleep. And thank God for the safety in which we were all sleeping last night compared to those in that city. Mr. Speaker, as you'll appreciate, a no-fly zone is somewhat difficult to implement in a hostile airspace against a peer adversary. We need to have our eyes wide open to the reality that in such an event, NATO jets would not possibly, but would most certainly probably come into a combat situation with Russian jets, and the risk of miscalculation and escalation and the triggering of Article 5 could not be understated in those circumstances. And particularly, Mr. Speaker, you'll appreciate that in the air domain, the risk of miscalculation is greater because things are happening at Mach 2, and there is no time for political calibration, and it is in the hands of pilots flying at well over the speed of sound. Mr. Speaker, no-fly zones come with all sorts of problems. I understand exactly why the Ukrainian ambassador is asking, but we need to be clear that that could well trigger an Article 5 moment, and we need to be clear-eyed about that reality in considering it. Mr. Speaker, I said in my answer to the original question that I don't propose to provide a commentary on the additional hardware that we will supply to the Ukrainian armed forces, nor the routes by which we would do so, if indeed, Mr. Speaker, we will. This is something that the Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister are clear about in terms of the requirement. We know that other European countries are keen to do likewise. But obviously this has to be provided at a pace and through routes that the Ukrainian armed forces are able to absorb in order to minimise the risk of the cache simply being destroyed or overwhelmed by advancing Russian forces. NATO is taking huge measures, Mr. Speaker, to reinforce its eastern flank. I've outlined in my initial response what the UK has done. That is an effort that has been more than matched by our best friends in the world, in the United States, and other NATO countries are also rallying to the flag. NATO has had, for the last 10 years or so, a network of enhanced forward presence battle groups. The UK is in Estonia. Those are all being reinforced and new forward presence battle groups being put in place. If the aim of what is going on right now was not just territorial gain in Ukraine, but to push NATO away from Russia, President Putin is achieving precisely the opposite, Mr. Speaker, because NATO is drawing the line around NATO countries ever thicker and ever stronger. Mr. Speaker, it won't surprise the honourable gentleman one bit to know that in the MOD we are quickly considering whether the threat has changed and whether more money is required. No defence minister would ever say that there isn't, but that is a conversation that needs to happen within government. And if you'll allow, Mr. Speaker, and I think the honourable gentleman would agree, This isn't a retail moment of politics where an issue arises and a solution be offered within the news cycle and then everybody moves on to the next thing. This is something that will define our role in the world for the next 20 years, and we've got time to make the right decisions.
Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House appreciates your willingness to allow this urgent question and the manner in which the Minister is briefing the House and the way that his colleagues are prepared to keep the House informed in this very rapidly developing crisis. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, President Putin launched a war in Europe. He is invading and killing people in a sovereign country that Russia itself guaranteed to respect. His attack on Ukraine is an attack on democracy, a grave violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. And Putin will not stop at Ukraine. He wants to divide and weaken the West. He wants to re-establish Russian control over neighbouring countries. These are the actions of an imperialist and a dictator. And Britain has a long tradition of standing up to such tyrants. We believe in freedom, in democracy, in the rule of law, in the right of a country to decide its own future, and these are the very values that Ukrainians are fighting for now in their country, and we must support their brave resistance in any way that we can. And yes, our thoughts are with the comrades and the families of those on both sides that have been killed in these first hours of fighting. Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday, the Prime Minister told the House the UK will be shortly providing a further package of military support to Ukraine. We understand the Minister's comments about detail, but has this further military assistance been provided? The Minister knows he has the Labour's full support for this. And he knows too that was announced and delivered before, the UK's short-range, handheld, anti-tank missiles are working well. And he knows that the Ukrainians need more of these urgently to defend Kiev and their other cities. So can he confirm that he is willing to go that bit further? The Minister just said Russia has failed to take any of its day one objectives. Which are the major objectives that it has failed to meet? And what is the government's assessment of why it has failed? Finally, Mr. Speaker, NATO leaders meet today. Does Britain support NATO's response force now being activated in full? What further contribution will the UK make to reinforcing NATO allies on the eastern flank? And when will the 1,000 UK troops on standby to help with humanitarian assistance be deployed? And finally, the Minister mentioned the doubling up of British forces in Estonia. When will these be deployed and in place? Mr. Speaker, we've taken peace and security in Europe for granted since the end of the Cold War. We can no longer do that. And I fear that we will be dealing with the consequences of this Russian invasion now for years to come.
Minister.
Thank the right honourable gentleman for his question and indeed the way that he and his front bench Labour colleagues have engaged with the government throughout all of this. It just goes to show, Mr. Speaker, that at times of national emergency this House is at its very best. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is absolutely right that NLAW has already proven to be invaluable. They are unsubstantiated reports, but nonetheless we are aware of a number of circumstances in which they've been used to defeat Russian armour, and we're therefore very aware of their utility, both in open battle during the initial phase of the conflict, but also in the urban domain in any resistance or insurgency that might follow. And it won't surprise the right honourable gentleman to know that NLAW, amongst other systems that have similar dual utility, both in open battle and in whatever may come next, are high on our list of things that we are looking to supply. I can sense his frustration, Mr. Speaker, and I know the House would like to hear the full detail. Suffice to say, the Secretary of State has instructed military officers in defence to look across the full UK inventory for everything that we have right now and look at what might be usable in the circumstances and to look at whether or not that could be sent forward and absorbed by the Ukrainians. But one has to be clear, Mr. Speaker, that most systems require some degree of training, and it's not just therefore the logistics of moving them to the country, nor indeed the challenges of the export of systems in which you need all of those countries who have got IP or operate the system to give their permission for it to be donated, but also the ability to train up Ukrainian forces to use it thereafter. But we are leaving no stone unturned, and the Right Honourable Gentleman should be assured that we want to see as much British kit in the hands of Ukrainians as we can manage. He asked about which objectives were not taken. He'll forgive me if, whilst clearly we indulge in a bit of information manoeuvre from the dispatch box, Mr. Speaker, to remind the Russian public that President Putin may well have bitten off more than he can chew. We're not going to compromise the intelligence that we've got altogether, but suffice to say we are pretty certain that in the Kremlin last night there will have been some pretty urgent reflections on the speed of the advance compared to what they anticipated, and I think the Russian people should be calling President Putin and the kleptocracy that surrounds him out on that, because young Russian men and women are being sacrificed in the name of President Putin's hubris. As for the NATO response force, Mr. Speaker, further contributions are under consideration. The UK is already the second largest contributor in terms of the surge forces that have come forward, second only to the United States. But we're clear that we may need to provide more both in land, sea and air, and we will do if other NATO allies are unable to respond at the pace that we could. The 1,000 troops that he mentions that are on standby for humanitarian support in the countries immediately adjoining Ukraine will be deployed as and when those countries ask for them, but thus far no request has come. They remain at high readiness, forward present at a camp very close to RAF Bryce Norton so that they can be deployed at hours' notice. But at the moment, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Poland have not yet asked for that support. And Mr. Speaker, he asked about when the enhanced forward presence battle groups will have been doubled up and the brigade headquarters will be in place. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all colleagues to follow the excellent Twitter feed of the 3rd United Kingdom Division, the Iron Division as they call themselves. There were some fantastic pictures yesterday of Challenger 2 tanks being loaded up onto the low-loader trucks to be driven north through Poland, Lithuania, Latvia and into Estonia. That is an extraordinary effort for a battle group that wasn't supposed to be deploying for 3 more months, was in the middle of a training routine in Germany, and they have turned that around very, very quickly. It's a testament not only to the Royal Welsh Battle Group, but also to their brigade headquarters, to 3rd Division and to the Field Army that that work has been completed so quickly. We expect them to be complete in Tapa by the 1st of March.
Holy Labour.
Mr. Speaker, what reassurance can my honourable friend give to the Ukrainian community in Derby and Derbyshire who will have family members over there that we are doing all we can to support the everyday ordinary Ukrainian families that live and are having to put up with this incursion from Putin? And I'd just like to ask him to give assurance that we are doing whatever we can.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, last night as the Secretary of State and I had to leave the Prime Minister's statement to go back to the MOD for another briefing, to the surprise of his protection officers, we decided to walk back through the protest that was happening on Whitehall. And Mr. Speaker, I was struck not by the anger and the screaming and shouting that normally accompanies protests in Westminster, but just by the incredible somberness, the resolve, but also the fearfulness that was in so many in that protest, because they, as the Honourable Lady says, will have family and friends back home in Ukraine. This isn't them protesting over a political cause. This is them protesting to help with the safety of their loved ones. The United Kingdom is not regarded by the Ukraine as one of its best friends in the world by accident. For the last 10 years, we've been training the Ukrainian armed forces through Operation Orbital. We were one of the first movers in providing lethal aid, and we sent troops to Ukraine only 2 or 3 weeks ago when the build-up of Russian troops was well underway to deliver the training that was required to allow those highly successful anti-tank weapons to be employed in battle as they now have been. We will continue to do all that we possibly can, and I know that my right honourable friend, the excellent Minister for Europe, is driving hard to make sure that all of the necessary consular support is in place so that people who have connections to Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine have the ability to be supported through the excellent work of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald, the SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm grateful to the Minister and indeed to his colleague in the Foreign Office for the work that they're doing and the updates that they've been ensuring opposition members have. And like the Minister and other members of the House, only wish to heap praise on the Ukrainian armed forces who have ensured that Russia didn't get the opening gambit that they thought they would. But like the Minister says, we have Russian men being sent to die for one man's hubris. And my goodness, what courage was shown on the streets of Russia last night by people protesting against that aggression coming from the Kremlin, and we commend them for it. Mr Speaker, the Minister rightly mentions in terms of supporting Ukraine with military equipment, which we back the government in doing. It is obviously in some cases easier said than done. It requires training, logistics and all the rest of it. But the Ukrainian government does need that, and I'm not going to ask him for an assurance that he's already given, but I just want to press him that these benches want to see Ukraine get all the equipment that it does need. In particular, one issue that does come up a lot, and again, I know he doesn't want to go into specific areas of equipment, satellite phones are in bad need, and I would just want to put that on record, that in the various conversations I've had with government and parliamentary officials in Ukraine, even actually at the protest outside the Downing Street last night, the issue of satellite phones has come up quite a bit. Can I ask what consideration has been given by the government and by G7 allies as to cyber support that can be given, and in particular on cyber offensive support? Would that constitute, I can see the Minister's face, but would that constitute an Article 5 scenario or not? What does the government understand that to be? And can I also ask if that the government ensures that it gives the appropriate level of humanitarian and medical equipment support that the Ukrainian government needs as well? And can I ask, and forgive me, I haven't heard him mention this yet, for an update, and this isn't an MOD thing necessarily, on where we are with SWIFT. Members of the House had hoped that we would have had progress on that by now. I know that the Foreign Office has been pressing hard on it, but it would be useful to have an update on where we are with that.
Mr Speaker, everything that the honourable gentleman said on lethal aid is well heard. We're working on it best pace. We'll do as much as we physically can at this stage, and so too will the United States and other allies. We're just looking at how it would be practically done. The honourable gentleman is absolutely right that there are a whole range of things, satellite phones most obviously, that provide the resilience to the functioning of a Ukrainian government, military and perhaps in time resistance when they are operating in an electronically denied environment and with all the probability of cyber attacks and everything else that will make the functioning of the Ukrainian government ever harder. We're very aware of that requirement. Likewise, medical supplies and other things which we're working on. The honourable gentleman saw me wince. I'm afraid that offensive cyber operations and the government's legal position on that is very much a matter for the Attorney General and the Prime Minister and not something I'm going to comment on at the dispatch box. And he asks about removing Russia from the SWIFT system. He will have heard my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, I think perhaps on the news this morning, saying that Her Majesty's Government is very, very keen that that is a sanction that is imposed. It's not in our gift to do unilaterally or even multilaterally amongst the countries that have thus far agreed to do it. That is work that our colleagues in the Foreign Office are hard at work on. I hope that we can win the argument because it feels like a sanction that Russia would properly take up and sit up and take notice of.
To Luke Evans.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Much is rightly made of Russia's role in this, but also, obviously Belarus is playing a part as a staging post. What sanctions and steps are we taking to make sure Belarus feel the pain for what they're doing? But also, second, he talks about miscalculations. May I ask what assessment he has made about the accidental fire potentially going into other countries, because that is a big concern to my constituents. We inadvertently find ourselves in a war footing without meaning to be.
Sir?
Mr. Speaker, the Belarusian ambassador has been summoned to the Foreign Office today to have the views of Her Majesty's government shared with them. Belarus has also been included in the sanctions regime. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are acutely aware of the very grave risk of miscalculation. As I said in response to the initial question around a no-fly zone, things that are happening at Mach 2 and where border incursions can last for just seconds. Often it isn't heads of government who get to make the decision about whether a trigger on an anti-aircraft missile system is pulled, and we are working hard within NATO to make sure that all of those risks are clearly understood and the risk of miscalculation is minimised. But we need to be clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's absolutely no way in a situation as kinetic and dynamic as this that it can be removed altogether. And I'm certain, I'm afraid, that there will be moments of miscalculation. There was a Turkish ship yesterday that was apparently hit by one side or the other as it was leaving Odessa. Cool heads will be required if any such event were to happen.
Thank you, Mr.
Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Minister for his update and place on record the thoughts and prayers of everyone in my constituency of Pontypridd of the people of Ukraine. I, like members across the House, am already being contacted by worried constituents who have friends and family in Ukraine who are desperate to access safe routes out of the country. So can I reiterate the question posed by my good friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, and ask the Minister, will the 1,000 UK troops that he has placed on standby to help with the humanitarian crisis now be urgently deployed?
Mr. Speaker, just to be very clear, because I think, unless I don't want to do the Honourable Lady this service, but I think I might have understood a question to be, will the 1,000 troops go into Ukraine as they did into Kabul in the summer to facilitate the egress of Ukrainians? I'm afraid the Honourable Lady will be disappointed. That's just simply not something that could be realistically done. This is a highly kinetic combat situation, and the probability of NATO troops being caught up in combat with Russian armed forces is far too high and would lead to huge escalation. The 1,000 troops that are on standby are there to support Hungary, Slovakia, Romania and Poland with the expected humanitarian challenges that they will face as people make their way out of Ukraine. They're at very high readiness. We'll get them forward as quickly as we can. But as we warned when we changed the travel advice, and my right honourable friend, the Minister for Europe, and I were on TV pulling no punches in the gravity of the situation, we were telling people to leave urgently precisely because there would be no opportunity to do as we did in Kabul in the summer.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister and the whole government for their leadership that they're showing on an international level at the moment. In winter 2015, I went to Ukraine with the former Defence Secretary as a special advisor to see Operation Orbital as it was being deployed. As part of that, we laid wreaths for the fallen Ukrainian soldiers. I, as a special advisor, was given a single carnation to put down, but felt slightly embarrassed in doing so because I didn't feel that we were doing as much as we possibly could be doing to help the Ukrainians. We weren't doing that because although we were giving lots of support and lots of sanctions, we were also hamstrung by the fact that we couldn't get agreement by as many of our European allies as we wanted to for everything that we would want to bring to bear. Reports in the New York Times yesterday suggested that Germany, Austria and Italy were refusing to cooperate on SWIFT payment. Belgium was trying to get opt-out for its diamond markets. Italy was trying to get opt-out for luxury handbags as part of European Union sanctions. Can I ask the Minister to ensure that all our diplomatic efforts are brought to bear on our European allies to ensure that they are not dragging their feet as we in this House and our American allies are really pushing forwards to try and do everything possible to help the people of Ukraine?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. He'll appreciate, first of all diplomatic effort is being focused on this. It is definitely Her Majesty's government's top foreign policy priority. I'd probably argue it's probably the top priority across government full stop at the moment to make sure that the response is completely cross Whitehall and is robust enough to have an impact on President Putin. But I'm sure the Honourable Gentleman will appreciate that this is not a moment, Mr Deputy Speaker, in which to think that a response must be provided within 24 hours or by the weekend or even by the end of next month. This is about making sure that the Western Alliance does not fracture, that we bring the whole of the free world with us in its condemnation of Russia, that Russia as a consequence is completely isolated. That is the way that the cost is imposed on Putin over time sufficient to ensure that not only does he fail in his ambitions to take and hold Ukraine, but he fails in his ability to remain as Russian president. He fails in his ability to anoint a successor of his choosing when the time comes. It is absolutely essential that the diplomatic effort, even if it requires a bit of patience, brings with us the whole of the Western alliance, because if Putin wants one thing more than the territorial gains in Ukraine, it is to see NATO fracture and Article 5 no longer mean anything.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The US Ambassador addressed the UN just a few days ago to say that up to 5 million refugees may be coming out of Ukraine and into the rest of Europe. And we're already witnessing on our television screens heartbreaking images of Ukrainians fleeing their homes, desperately trying to escape conflict. So what I want to ask today is, given that this refugee exodus is a scale like something we haven't seen since 2015, how will the MOD, alongside its European partners, contribute to the creation of humanitarian corridors, ensuring that refugees can be safely evacuated from the conflict zone? And finally, can we now end this ridiculous bill that's in the House of Lords, which will actually limit our opportunity to welcome refugees, quite rightly, to these shores?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, just to the point on the NAB first, I'm not sure I share his analysis of that bill. I think I answered the question earlier about what active role we can play within Ukraine's borders to facilitate the egress of Ukrainian people. I'm afraid that there's remarkably little that the international community can do there without the profound risk of it ending up as a NATO versus Russia fight with all of the escalation that that would cause. But Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend the Minister for Europe, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend the Minister for Europe spoke yesterday to all of the neighbouring countries' governments to make sure that they are aware of the support that the United Kingdom is able and ready to deliver, both militarily in terms of troops on the ground to help process, marshal, facilitate, secure refugees as they arrive in those countries. But actually, the MOD is just carrying baggage and facilitating. It's our great development and aid experts within the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office that will do the really impressive stuff when and if those requests come from neighbouring governments. And we'll make sure we're supporting the FCDO in all of their endeavours.
Danny Kruger.
Thank you, sir. The tyrant Putin is getting what he said he feared, a thicker and thicker line of defence around the NATO alliance. I'm very pleased that we are doubling our commitment to Estonia, principally through the Royal Welsh Battle Group. I'm proud that many of those units are based in my constituency of devisers, including the Royal Artillery, the Royal Engineers, and the Royal Tank Regiment. Will my honourable friend join me in honouring those troops and their families for the sacrifice that they are making?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend, his constituents and the service people that live in his constituency should be enormously proud of what the members of 12th Brigade, headquartered in Bulford, many living in Tidworth, are doing in Estonia today. I paid tribute earlier to the speed at which the Royal Welsh have gone from a training cycle in Germany to being driving north into Estonia, but so too to the many families of the Royal Tank Regiment who will have been expecting their loved ones home in the next couple of weeks and now who don't know when they'll be coming home because the extension of their tour is indefinite. That too is worthy of praise. They're fortunate to have such a fantastic advocate in the House of Commons.
Alex Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Reports indicate attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Could the Minister expand on how this is being tracked so that those who perpetrate these crimes and those who compel them to do so will be held to account?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, absolutely. Yesterday, many members of the House will have seen reported in the news that not only was the Russian ambassador summoned to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, where the top lines of Her Majesty's government were delivered, but so too was the Defence Attaché summoned to the Ministry of Defence. In the MOD, the discussion was very much around how we are recording the violations of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention that we have reported, our expectations that Russia will operate under those conventions, and our intent to make sure they're held to account wherever they don't.
Sir Christopher Cho.
Mr Deputy Speaker, can my honourable friend confirm that the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers will today decide to expel Russia from the Council of Europe?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, somewhat out of my lane, but I've just been told that there are discussions ongoing.
Brendan O'Hara.
Deputy Speaker, we know that the attacks on the area surrounding Kyiv originated in Belarus, making Lukashenko complicit in this aggression. And I'm pleased that Belarus will not go unpunished, and I hope it's a signal to anyone else thinking of supporting Putin's actions. But given that we've already placed sanctions on Belarus for their appalling human rights record, can you update the House on what these new sanctions are designed to do and how they're going to be targeted on Belarus?
Mr.
Mr Deputy Speaker, if you allow, I'll ensure the honourable gentleman is written to.
Diana Davison.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Honourable Member for Wellingborough for securing this urgent question. Though we sit safely some 2,000 miles away, the power of media and so
best we can, as she's seeing from all of the open source intelligence that's available on social media. This is a very different type of war to even Gulf War I and II. This is a social media age war, and these outrages are often there. Unfortunately, you can't always believe what you see, and so we're giving lots of thought to how we properly record, verify, and then make sure that people are held to account in due course.
Sally-Ann Hart.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I want to voice the condemnation of Mr Putin on behalf of residents of Hastings and Rye and their support of Ukrainian and their prayers. Ukrainian President Zelensky gave a Putin over his illegal invasion, and we have seen already extensive protests across Russia. Can my right honourable friend join President Zelensky in calling on Russian citizens who have never experienced a real democracy before to stand up against the Kremlin regime and its unprovoked aggression?
Mr Speaker, I absolutely can. As the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, leaders across the House have all been clear. Our fight is not with the Russian people. In fact, they have our most profound sympathies for the way that they are being disregarded at the moment. I hope that they will see that there is a better way of living in their country. I hope that they will stand up to President Putin and the kleptocracy that surrounds him. I hope that what the international community does, diplomatically, economically, militarily, and culturally, so much of the Cold War was a competition of values promoted through rival cultures, that across all of that, President Putin quickly comes to see that he's miscalculated badly, and soon enough, his days will be numbered.
Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Russia and the Kremlin's efforts in Ukraine are not just supported by a state apparatus. They're supported by a very shadowy network of black, grey, opaque interests in terms of finance and supply of arms, and not just in Ukraine but elsewhere as well. Could I commend to the Minister and the wider Treasury bench an excellent article today on Conservative Home by, not my usual reading, I have to say, but it is an excellent article with a lot of good concrete suggestions by Kate Foster from Protection Approaches, because it really is important to target not just the state support for the actions of the Kremlin in Ukraine, but also the wider networks that are supporting Kremlin's malfeasance elsewhere. I'm thinking particularly of Republika Srpska, because tackling those networks of finance and arms support would be a really useful thing for us to be doing.
Mr Deputy, first of all, I'll repay the bipartisan bonhomie with saying that I found an article on the geopolitical situation in Ukraine in the New Statesman particularly useful the other day. Not my usual read. Nor is Con Home, to be fair, but there we go. The honourable gentleman is absolutely right. This is not just about a military exchange, and nor is it about a headline set of sanctions. This is about bringing to bear a whole-of-government response that unpicks criminal networks, shell companies that are intricate across a number of different countries, some that are within multilateral fora in which we can have leverage, others that sit entirely out with. This will be a complicated business, but unpick it we must, because that's how you bring Russia to a place of complete isolation and therefore failure.
Virginia Crosby.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I too offer my prayers and support for the people of Ukraine on behalf of my unsworn constituents. This outrage against international law is happening just 2.5 flying hours from here, and I welcome the economic sanctions that have already put in place. The Minister has mentioned SWIFT, and that shows how important that is. But can the Minister confirm to the House that the Prime Minister has stressed the importance of cutting Russia off from SWIFT with our international partners?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, he absolutely has. But we have to be clear, and I make no apology for showing this understanding, because I think it's important as a House that we do. The burden of the sanctions will fall unequally, and the sanctions will be completely meaningless if the regime collapses within 6 months because people start to fracture away. President Putin doesn't just want territorial gain, he wants the fracture of the Western alliance and for NATO and Article 5 to become meaningless. It's really, really important that we do the diplomacy urgently, that we succeed, that we bring the international community with us. But I don't think it's particularly helpful if people from the dispatch box or anywhere else give too much opprobrium to those countries who have clearly got a lot to consider before they sign up to it, as much as I think that they should.
Mike Kane.
Following on from the member for Hastings and Rye, Sky News is reporting, Mr Deputy Speaker, that over 1,700 brave souls, Russian souls, were arrested last night across 54 cities, protesting the shedding of both young Russian and Ukrainian blood, as the Minister has pointed out. Will the Minister join with me in sending solidarity to that protest movement and reiterate to the House that our quarrel is not with the Russian people, it is with Putin, and he has committed a very grave error?
Mr Deputy Speaker, Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right. May those protests grow, may they flourish, may their voice be impossible to ignore.
Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome the Minister's remarks and also those of my right honourable friend, the Shadow Defence Secretary. The Minister has rightly made much of the need to maintain the unity of the Western alliance. But can I ask him what efforts have been made to reach out beyond that alliance, in particular to China, to try and discourage China for offering any active or indeed implicit support to what Putin has done?
Minister.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, first of all, absolutely the work of Her Majesty's government and governments around NATO to reach out beyond the Euro-Atlantic and to the rest of the world have been going on at pace, and a number of countries have already joined in European and North Atlantic countries in imposing sanctions of their own. He's absolutely right that this is a moment of real decision for China. If China wants to be a world leader, then China needs to show that it stands for a world rules-based international system. And Her Majesty's government will encourage it to take a stand to do so. And I think this evening in New York there is an opportunity for China to show that that is where it stands. If it doesn't, Mr Deputy Speaker, it will have set out its stall all too clearly, but let's hope they can be persuaded otherwise.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the European Union imposed sanctions on the Russian Defence Minister, Sergei Shoigu, and a number of other Russian military officials. Does the UK government have any plans to do similar?
Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's the policy of the government not to talk about future sanctions. I suspect, for fear that that therefore becomes part of the calculation in the Kremlin over what to do or not to do next in a way that might not be entirely helpful. Although I accept there's a counter-argument, it could be deterrent, but I think on balance it's probably right to keep people guessing about what else might be up our sleeve if things don't stop soon.
I'd like to thank Mr Bone for his urgent question and the Minister for responding to the questions for just under an hour. And I'd also like to thank all members at short notice for coming to ask ministers the questions that they have today. As was said, the thoughts and prayers of the British Parliament and indeed the British people are with the people of Ukraine today. Thank you very much. We're now going to resume with the business that was interrupted by the urgent question, and that the question is that the Marriage and Civil Partnership Minimum Age Bill be read the third time. And I call Sally Ann Hart to resume her speech.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So going back to the Forced Marriage Unit, which set out additional information on the cases it dealt with in 2020. Of the cases that the Forced Marriage Unit provided advice or support to in 2020, 26% involved victims below 18 years of age, 37% involved victims aged 18 to 25, and 9% involved victims with mental capacity concerns. 79% involved female victims and 21% involved male victims. Last year, the government published its Tackling Violence Against Women and Girls strategy, which sets out a range of actions aimed at tackling acts of violence or abuse that disproportionately affect women and girls. Forced marriage is identified as one such issue, and the strategy states that the government remains committed to the goal of ending child marriage in this country and has indicated the need to signal to other countries that child marriage is something that needs to be tackled. The strategy also states that child marriage and having children too early in life can deprive children of important life chances, which is why the government will support raising the age of marriage and civil partnership in England and Wales from 16 to 18. And it said, when an appropriate legislative vehicle becomes available to help stamp out marriage of minors. The age of 18 is widely recognised as the age at which one becomes an adult and at which full citizenship rights should be granted. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill is the legislative vehicle to stamp out the marriage of minors, and I wholeheartedly support it and the amendments included today. Thank you.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, and my very sincere congratulations to my right honourable friend, the member for Bromsgrove, who got the ball rolling on this, but principally to my honourable friend for Mid Derbyshire for her heroic work getting the bill to this point, and to her family, I think, in the gallery, presumably married at a respectable age. My congratulations, and most of all to the campaigners. It is a tremendous thing what you have done, and I'm very much in awe of your campaigning and your work. So many, many thanks and congratulations. As my honourable friend says, if you are too young to consent to marriage, you are too young to marry. That is an absolutely inviolable point, and I am glad that we are honouring the declarations of various international bodies, of UNICEF, which says that child marriage is a violation of human rights, our own commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, which committed this country to eliminate child early or forced marriage, and to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which says that there should be no legal way to marry before 18, even with parental consent. Now, I understand that in the last year that data was collected, 2018, there were only 147 marriages of people aged 16 or 17. 80% of those were female, were girls, which tells a tale. But of course, the real concern that we have is the marriages that take place abroad of children and then can be recognised here in the UK. And I echo the point made by my honourable friend and many other honourable members that we are not about criminalising the actions of children with this legislation, but seeking to stop adults organising child marriage. And I pay particular tribute to the honourable gentleman from Ealing Southall, who spoke so well and passionately and with enormous sincerity about his own mother and the work that she did, having been a child bride herself, to found a school in her village, to educate girls, and what an inspiration she must have been, both to her own daughters who grew up to have professional careers and to the honourable member himself. So I'm grateful to have heard that story. I applaud the commitment in this legislation to remove what the honourable lady calls the Gretna Green exceptions, and I'm very pleased to hear that Northern Ireland is consulting on raising the age of marriage, and I hope that Scotland does so too. I'm sure that they will want to align with the Sustainable Development Goals as soon as possible. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think I can speak accurately when I say that I'm sure my honourable friend is not anti-marriage in this legislation. I know that she has the opposite attitude. We need more marriage in this country. And I recognise what the honourable gentleman for Meeting Southall said about the dangers of the life-limiting effects of early marriage. But I think we can overcompensate, and to a degree in this country I think we have done. And I was dismayed to hear from the honourable lady that the average age of marriage in this country is now over 30. That concerns me. I think we have organised our economic and social rewards in our society to put off marriage and children until very late. And I regret that. I think the decline of marriage in our society should be a cause of great regret. It's the cause of much distress to adults. And we're talking about the rights of children here. The greatest right a child has is to a secure home. And we know that marriage is the best means of ensuring this. And there are many pressures that are placed on families in our society, economic pressures. We have the smallest houses and the longest commutes in Europe. What does that do to family life? We've removed the fiscal supports for marriage steadily over the last 2 generations. And we also have a cultural or ideological attack on marriage and on the family. There's this assumption that it is a patriarchal institution, inherently abusive, inherently unequal. And of course, I'm afraid to say, and we've heard stories today of cases in which that can be the case. So we need to remove the dangers of fulfilling that false stereotype of marriage. Marriage is a public act for a reason. In the Anglican service, we are asked to give any just cause or impediment why a couple should not be married. And we need to remove the possibility of abuse through this legislation, to remove the opportunity for child marriages. Marriage is fundamentally about the responsibilities of adulthood. It is the foundation of our society, and this bill restores the integrity of the institution, and I'm very proud to support it. Thank you.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to speak in the third reading of the Marriage and Civil Partnership Minimum Age Bill, and I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the member for